And back then, the theme I had was, who do men say that Jesus is? And of course, this comes from Matthew 16:13. Oh, that's not the one. Matthew 16:13 through 18, where Jesus asks his disciples, who do men say that the Son of Man is? And they responded, some say John the Baptist, others say that Jesus is Elijah, others said that Jesus was Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And then Jesus asked the question, who do men say that I am? And the response that he got back from Simon Peter was, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus commended Peter and his profession. He said, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. Now, the rock, I understand as being the profession of faith that Peter just made. Now, the Roman Catholics would definitely disagree with me, and they would say that the rock upon which Jesus' church would be built was Peter as the pontiff or the head of the church, which then leads to this procession of popes, which supposedly can be traced all the way back to Peter. However, if that's what Jesus meant, there'd be no reason to go through this, question. Who do men say that I am? He would just have to say, Peter, you're the first pope, and you're going to be the cornerstone for the church that I built. He didn't have to go into this, who do men say that I am? The very fact that that's linked, the rock upon which my church will be built, being tied in with this question of who do men say that I am, and Peter's response has to tell you that this rock is the profession of faith. And that profession of faith is, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, I had asked last week, or the last class and the week before that, where could Peter have gotten this idea? Jesus said, my Father in heaven has revealed this to you, but I suggest that there was another way Peter could have understood this, short of a divine revelation. Anyone remember, where could Peter have gotten this from? No, where both the terms Christ, anointed one, and the Son of the living God, where would we have found those two terms?
Psalm 2.
Psalm 2, yay, Andy. Yeah, we don't have any lollipops, but you get one later, Eddie. Very good. So Psalm 2 is where we find these two terms together. And that, if there's nothing you get from this class, that should get stuck in your brain. Mark it with a big black indelible marker. The profession of faith that Peter gave here comes from Psalm 2. And I recommend, if you don't read Psalm 2 or Psalms often, read Psalm 2. It is really so much more there that has to be considered whenever this profession of faith is talked about. You just can't say Jesus is the Christ and leave it, because it means nothing out of its context. So we don't have the time to go into that. I don't want to retrace and recover everything I did 3 weeks ago. But that's what kind of started this. And then I asked the question today, how would this question of Jesus be answered? Who do men say that I am? And things have gotten a lot more complicated than it was 2,000 years ago. Today, you're going to get some interesting responses. One would be, if you happen to be talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, you'd get the answer, well, Jesus is the Archangel Michael who came down to earth and became Jesus. I have no idea who Jesus is today, whether he's still an angel or whether he's a man or whether he's something in between, but that's for Jehovah's Witnesses to figure out. The most common answer you're going to get out of mainstream Christians, if you were to ask this question of them, would be that Jesus is God, which is quite an interesting answer. And I had asked, where do the mainstream Christians get this idea that Jesus is God? And one of the reasons they believe that Jesus is God is that occasionally in the scriptures, you find the title God associated with Jesus. And the most prominent one, most popular one is from John 20:28. I remember if I've got that up here. Yes, I do. So whether you can read it from your Bibles or read it from the screen, let's read John 20:27 through 29. We can start with you, Matt.
Yep. John 20:27 to 29. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe."
Okay. Now, I don't think I have the slide here, but if you were to back out, if that's not it, if you were to turn to John 20, right after Jesus says this and after Thomas makes his profession, we find that John, the writer, says that he has written this entire book for one purpose. And what was that purpose?
That you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God.
Okay. Does that sound familiar to something we had just read a few minutes ago?
Peter's confession.
Peter's profession of faith. You have the Christ and you have the Son of God. Now, I had asked my last class, and I'll ask now, if John, the gospel writer, wanted to get across the very, very important point that Jesus was God, you would think he would have said that as a follow-up to Thomas's confession. The gospel writer does not do that. Instead, he says, I'm writing this book, including Thomas's quote or profession here, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay, so this is why when we find Thomas's profession here, where God is used in conjunction with Jesus as Lord, we're going to have to conclude that there's something else going on here. Now, we talked about 2 weeks ago that, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. Just a couple chapters preceding this, you will find Jesus explaining this to his disciples because they asked, show us the Father. I would suggest to you this is what's happening with Thomas. He finally recognizes that through Jesus, God's agent, he has seen essentially God as close as you're going to be able to see God and live. And this is what we find here. So this really falls short of a really strong proof of text that Jesus is God. Another passage that is commonly brought forward is John 1. And this is the passage I was looking for. Anyway, let's move forward. Yeah, this is the one. Okay, so John 1 is often brought forward as a proof text for Jesus being God. And 2 weeks ago, I had shared with you some old English manuscripts. And I don't know, probably from the back, you're not going to be able to see this. But several weeks ago, this was up on the screen, and you could see how, let me get the pointer, that the word, this is in the beginning was the word was with God, and the word was God. And you will find in the old English, the first 4 or 5 English translations that went to print, and even before it went to print, that the word was lowercase, and the pronouns that are associated with word is a neutered it rather than a masculine him. But you will not find this in any printed copy within the last 400 years. No one here has a copy of John 1 where the word is lowercase or the pronoun associated with it is a neuter it. So John 1 is another one of these passages that are often brought forward to support the idea that Jesus is God. Now, that's all that we covered 2 classes back. I wanted to get into new material, and I wanted to ask this other question. So, mainstream Christians say that they believe Jesus is God because, one, occasionally, literally a handful of times, like this, profession from Thomas, you'll find the word God, which in the Greek and even going back into the Hebrew is a term that has been applied to men, to those to whom the word of God has been given. Even Jesus made that point. But there's other reasons why mainstream Christians believe Jesus is God. One of the other reasons, anyone want to take a stab at it?
I and my Father are one.
Yeah, one what? One God? He doesn't say one God. And it's not too long after that, he says, I pray to the Father that my disciples would be one just as I and the Father are one. Jesse?
Well, a lot of the Christians that believe in the Trinity derive great satisfaction from the concept that God died for them. It elevates them because even God had to die for them. And I'm not sure why they're fascinated with the idea that God would die for them, but this means a lot to them.
That's absolutely correct. But is that a reason why people believe, or mainstream Christians believe, Jesus is God?
Nicene Creed.
Okay, Nicene Creed, if you actually read it, it says Jesus is God of very God, which is a derivative of God, which doesn't quite, it's a God, lowercase perhaps. But I'm going to stick with the Bible, okay? In the Bible, why would mainstream Christians believe that Jesus is God outside a few number of times the word God is associated with Jesus? Casey?
Or outside of this, I'm not sure. There's that one that we've looked at before in Isaiah.
But that would make, okay, so it would be the mighty God, the everlasting. So those would be one of the instances where God is associated, but even Jesus is mentioned specifically there. And I think actually that title is a reference to a son that would be born in the days of Isaiah. So if you're going to apply it to Jesus as God, then there's some person that was born in the days of Isaiah who was likewise God in the same sense. So yes, that's another one of those instances where the word God is linked with the Messiah. But let's anything else? Another reason why Jesus is believed to be God.
Randy, you should answer this. This sounds like a Randy question.
It sounds like a Randy. Okay, Randy, you're on the spot. Answer.
I would say because the way he was born.
Because the way he is.
He was born, conceived.
Miraculously. But there's been many miraculous births. Isaac.
But directed by the Holy Spirit, by God's Spirit.
Okay. All right. I'll accept it, but that's not the one I was looking for. As Randy would say, that's not what I'm looking for. Can you read my mind? Just I think what Randy would say.
His exaltation.
Okay, you're very close. What I'm looking for is Jesus is worshipped in the New Testament. Okay, that's one of the reasons why mainstream Christians believe Jesus is God. Now, is that a valid argument to make? Well, let's examine that. So today, let's start. So Matthew, kind of keeping with Randy's idea here of birth, let's read about the birth of Jesus from Matthew 2, verses 7 through 11. Randy, if you do the duty, Matthew 2, 7 through 11. And if you can speak loud enough. Okay.
Then Jesus, then Herod, when he had something from the wise men, inquired diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. And when they had heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, who came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Okay, thanks. So this is the, the Christmas story we hear around Christmas time of the wise men coming to Bethlehem in search of the Christ. Now, here we have the word worship associated with Jesus. How do we know that the wise men did not come to worship God?
Because the reason why they were sent was from Herod. They dispatched them to go.
But how does that prove that Jesus isn't God?
Does that have something to do with the gifts?
No, I wasn't thinking of that. Do you think Herod thought Jesus or the Christ was God?
No.
Okay. But it said, the first time the word worship appeared, it said, go find out where the Christ is born so that I may come and worship him. Okay. So this seemed highly unlikely that we're talking about worship as God. All right. So there's got to be a different sense of this term worship here. We'll keep looking at this term, but it doesn't seem like this would be a verse that you could support the idea that Jesus is God. I just don't see Herod as wanting to worship the new baby as God. So let's move forward.
And furthermore, in the Jewish mindset, you would have been completely foreign to them. Because God would never do that. If a man were to even claim that they were the son of God, there was a warrant for them to be stoned because it was blasphemous. So there's no reason that they would have had that mentality. This is actually God.
Right. And if you can remember back from 2 or 3 classes back, I had said that not only is the Christ and the Son of God 2 terms that you find together in the 2 professions here, but in Psalm 2, there's one other title that's used in conjunction with the anointed and with my son, and that title is King. And it also says my King on Zion. So you would have had this Son of God title, the kind of like this word association would have come to a Jew's mind in the first century as being a reference to a Jewish king. Randy.
In that light, Matthew 2 said that the wise men were looking for he who was born king of the Jews.
Right, exactly. Very good. Thank you.
And then throughout, you hear him on more than one occasion say, not exactly these words, but why do you call me good? There's one that is good, right?
Okay. So moving forward, Matthew 14, verses 30 through 33. So this is Jesus walking on the water. Lisa, if you could read Matthew 14, 30 through 33.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time finding 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, O man of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God.
All right, question. How do we know that the disciples did not believe that Jesus was God here when the disciples worshiped Jesus? How do we know the disciples did not believe Jesus was God here?
They would have said, you are our God.
Yeah, and what did they say?
Son of God.
Thou art the Son of God. Okay, so we don't get this worship is required to be to God only. We're kind of getting that impression here. Let's go to a new passage. This is toward the end of Matthew. We've been sticking with Matthew. I think we'll stick with Matthew a little bit longer. Matthew 28, verses 16 through 18. Kathy, are you able to do that? Matthew 28, 16 through 18.
Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.
Okay, question. How do we know that the disciples weren't worshiping Jesus here as God? How do we know? The passage tells us. Lisa, you're shaking your head.
All power is given unto me. He's God's agent.
All power is given to me. Now, that would seem like a very strange statement to make if you're God. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. So this, again, this worship doesn't prove Jesus is God, because the contexts themselves are kind of disproving such a theory. All right, but let's keep on plugging away at it. Let's kind of like maybe ask a different question. Who are Christians supposed to worship? That would kind of seem like that, yeah. But if you were to take that, then how do you explain the fact that Jesus has been worshipped through all this, but we're trying to make the case Jesus is not God? Okay, you gave me the right answer, but you can see the predicament when you answer only God can be worshiped, or we should only worship God, or should we? Can we perhaps worship God and worship something else? So let's kind of feel around with that question. This is a passage where probably it may be probably the densest instance where the word worship appears. I don't know, for those who can see the screen in red, I've highlighted every instance of worship, and it's like all over. This is John 4, and I will go ahead and read that for the sake of time. This is verse 20 through 24. And just make a note of how many times the word worship pops up here in different forms. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship, ye know not what. We worship what we know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews, but the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, a couple interesting things here besides just the frequency of the word worship. Who is the one that's desiring worship in this? The Father. Yeah. It says, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. Now, those here with a New International Version or New American Standard, can you raise your hand? NIV or NAS? Okay, so we have at least two. Okay. Casey, you have what?
NIV.
NIV. And Ellen? New American Standard? Great. Okay. Do you have worship in each of these occasions? Is worship there over and over again, or do you have something other than worship?
It's more worship for me.
Okay. You got worship. Okay, so we've confirmed this is the King James, NAS, and NIV all have worship, worship, worship.
ASB as well.
Okay, thank you. So if Jesus says that our ultimate true worship is to be to the Father, why is Jesus worshiped in the passages that we just went through in Matthew? Maybe we need to kind of look at this word worship. What does it mean? If you were to pull up in a dictionary and look at the etymology of this word, you'll discover the root of our problem. Today, we kind of have this knee-jerk reaction when you hear the word worship. Like, you think of God, you think of religion, but that's not necessarily all that should be the context in which worship could occur. The meaning of the word worship, if you trace it back to its origin, simply means to give worth to something. And, believe it or not, I was worshiped earlier this week. And I was worshiped when I got a phone call asking me to fill in as your Sunday school teacher. And what I'm saying is someone deemed me worthy of being your teacher this morning. Now, whether you agree or not is another matter, but somebody, that he was desperate, okay? But that's one way that the term can be used. If you view somebody as worthy, whenever you do that as a result of that impression is worship. Now, for those who have been lawfully wedded here, I'm going to perhaps, for men in particular here, maybe open your eyes to something. If you were alive 500 years ago, you probably would have been in England as an Englishman. And if you wanted to get married, you would have to come before a priest in the Church of England, and they would perform a solemnization of matrimony. And I was able to find the original from 1552 words that were used back then to marry a couple. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I thought this was very interesting. And, sometimes you wonder about where you hear some of the terms in the common marriage ceremonies. You'll hear some coming from the Book of Prayer from the Anglican Church from 1552. Some of this will sound very familiar. So it starts off, dearly beloved friends, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of his congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. All right. Now, this goes on for 2 pages. Now, I'm going to skip to the good part here. So they exchange some vows, and the priest is handed the ring. And the priest then hands the ring to the groom. And the groom takes the ring, places it on the left finger, fourth finger, and he is told to repeat the following words. And I want you to listen. With this ring, I thee wed. With my body, I thee worship. And with all my worldly goods, I thee endow. Okay? So men are instructed, or they were instructed 500 years ago, to worship their wives. Okay? So, this is how the word worship, at its origins, is how we should understand the word. It doesn't have to have the connotation of religious worship. It just means that you consider someone worthy of your attention or admiration or service. So maybe this kind of helps how the term has been used up to this point in conjunction with Jesus. Now, I think it's also useful if we not only look at the English, so here's the ring ceremony words here. If we consider, because the Bible wasn't written in English, we have our New Testament handed to us in Greek. And the word worship that we've encountered over and over and over again from the Greek is the Greek word proskuneo. And let's look at this particular passage here. This is going to tell us that this word proskuneo, which is translated worship, can be applied to something other than a religious figure. Right, so Matthew 18, 23 through 26, I'm going to read this from the King James. Ellen and Casey, I want you to follow along, and afterwards I'm going to ask you both a question. What is different in your version? So, Matthew 28,
Wait, is it 28? or
sorry,
18? I think it's 18.
yeah, I guess I had typed, it's Matthew 18, sorry, 18, 23 through 26. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. But as for much as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife and children, and all that he had in payment to be made. And the servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. All right, so those with the NIV and NAS, what is different?
This one's prostrated.
Prostrated in the NAS. All right, and Casey?
The NIV is fell on his knees.
Fell on his knees. Okay.
Mine says implore.
What was that?
Implore.
Implored? Okay. But we definitely don't have worship. Okay. So something's interesting here. Why do we not have worship like the King James? It's the very same Greek word, proskuneo. And this is where things start getting a little funny. Okay, you might call it someone's monkeying with the translations because it is the very same Greek word. Now, I want you to jump ahead to Revelation 3, verse 9, same exercise now. So those with the NIV and NAS, I want you to answer the question afterwards of what's different. So from the King James, behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee. So what's different with
What verses are we reading?
what version am I reading?
Verses.
Revelation 3, verse 9.
The NIV says, make them come and fall down at your feet.
Fall down at your feet, okay? New American Standard, bow down at your feet. It's the very same Greek word, proskuneo. Okay, why are the modern translations changing this?
It takes away some of their ammunition if the word has multiple applications.
So what would be interesting for those who are reading all the passages in Matthew where Jesus was proskuneoed, we have worship. But when it's someone other than Jesus, it's bow down. Something is odds here. Why? It's the same word. Why don't they continue with the King James using the word worship? Maybe because today we think of worship as religious worship, that only God can be worshiped. So if we retain the word worship in the new versions, when we come across proskuneo with Jesus and God, well, somehow maybe we can get them closer together as being like one. But then when we're talking about a servant or in the book of Revelation, this church, the Jews were going to bow down before the believers. Well, then we don't want to, we're going to have to use a different term. Could that be what's going on?
I wouldn't say it's done intentionally, the meaning of words change.
Then why not use bow down in the Matthew passages that we had read earlier when Jesus was walking on the water? Your version said the disciples worshiped Jesus.
Yeah.
They did. It's the same proskuneo. So if your theory is right, you ought to be consistent, no? So someone's not being consistent is the point I'm trying to make. And the question is, why are they not being consistent?
Question. Is there any connection between this worship bow down and Psalm 212, which says kiss the Son?
Well, kissing, I would have to bring up, actually, Lisa, you could probably do it in Psalm 2 with the N-word out and tell me what is, well, that's not going to help because it's going to be Hebrew. Yeah, I would have to look in to see what the Septuagint says. I doubt that, it'd be an interesting question to find out.
Yeah.
I would have to get back to you on that because I wasn't prepared to have a Greek. But you could, I mean, if you bow down and kiss somebody, their feet, you are worshiping them in the sense. Okay. The question is, in the Greek translation, would you find proskuneo? That's a good question. I'll try to look into that.
And Phil, like, just historically speaking, even over the last 200 years, worship has only been seemingly exclusively applied to religious worship. But there's a routine, like there was a show on HBO a long time ago about John Adams, and like he goes to see the king in it, right? And so he has this routine he has to go
Yeah.
through to prostrate himself and
Exactly.
essentially worship the king. So there's always been that disparity until recently.
And I wouldn't be surprised that in some of these old or PBS reenactments, when you have a monarchy and you come before them, you would perhaps say, thy worship, that would be a term that we'd use before a monarch. Jesse?
Yeah, so when there are multiple synonyms for one word, you could translate. You go by the context, and if the context is that Jesus is, by the context, if in their mind Jesus is God, then they're going to use the elevated term whenever they reference it.
Right.
It wouldn't be an intentional corruption on their part. It would be, that is the correct context when referring to Jesus.
It's hard to know what the motives were, but I will bet you, kind of like the lowercase w in John 1 and the it neuter, that you'd probably sell more copies if you were of the Bible, your translation you're trying to sell, if you pander to a particular already existing popular theory. If you were to change it and the disciples simply bowed down, you'd probably hear a lot of hollering among mainstream Christians if that was a consistent, accurate translation. So I think something's going on, whether it's intentional or not. You can debate between yourself and another time. Let's look at another instance. 1 Chronicles 29. It's very interesting. 1 Chronicles 29. So this is from the King James, and those who have the NIV and NES will have the same exercise. And David said to all the congregation, now bless the Lord your God, and all the congregation blessed the Lord of their fathers, and bowed down their heads and worshiped the Lord and the King. All right, so NIS, we have what?
Homage. Did homage.
They did homage. All right, Casey, 1 Chronicles 29:20 in the NIV. 29:20.
The ESV also says paid homage, not worship.
ESV says paid homage.
Prostrating themselves. before
So
the-
Casey has prostrate. Okay. Would you? Okay, well, the thing I had mentioned earlier, that our Old Testament comes from the Hebrew, but there is a translation called the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. This was done in the 2nd or 3rd century BC. And would you believe it or not, the word here behind the word worship in the Greek is proskuneo, the very same one we've seen over and over again in Matthew and Revelation. Same word, same thing's happening. Now, I will bet you if David wasn't in the picture, here, if David wasn't in the picture, I will bet you that all the modern translations would have used the word worship. Okay, but if we have the word worship and David's in the picture, well, then kind of like the gig's up, because a king can be worshiped without any problem. And if that's the case, then the argument that Jesus is God because he's worshiped goes down the drain. Okay, so like you can begin to see something, again, whether it's intentional, I don't know, but something's funky here.
That's a different word.
In the Greek Septuagint, proskuneo is
It's in the Psalms. I guess that's the thing.
in 1 Chronicles 29:20, the Greek translation for this verse, where we have in the King James worship, and everyone else did homage. It's the Greek word proskuneo, which is the very same word we've run over and over again. When the wise men came to Bethlehem and worshiped, that's proskuneo. When the Jews were to worship before the churches in the book of Revelation, that's proskuneo. When the disciples worship Jesus, that's proskuneo. When it is God alone or Jesus, we're finding, even in the modern versions, it's translated as worship. But when the very same proskuneo is used with something other than Jesus or God, it all of a sudden becomes the humble did homage. Okay, that's my point. So this argument doesn't have a whole lot of legs to stand on about Jesus being God because he's worshiped. We're finding people can be worshiped proskuneo. David?
Were you gonna get to Acts chapter 10?
No, I was gonna go to Matthew 4.
Okay, well, Acts chapter 10 is where Peter goes to Cornelius to, preach the gospel, and in verse 25, it says, and as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshiped him. But Peter took him up and saying, stand up, I myself also am a man.
Okay,
So there you have, and it's that
Another-
proskuneo.
yeah.
So you got Cornelius worshiping Peter, and Peter saying, I'm a man.
all right. So I was actually trying to focus in on Matthew alone, because you'll find this type of situation throughout the Bible, New Testament. Matthew 4, we have an interesting situation we'll look at, and this is where Jesus is in the wilderness and he is tempted. So Matthew 4, verses 8 through 10 from the King James says, and again, the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain and sheweth him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, and saith unto him, all these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship proskuneo me. Then Jesus saith unto him, get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship proskuneo, the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. Now, one of the criticisms that mainstream Christians will level against us as Christadelphians is that we are idolaters. Why? Because we worship Jesus, but we don't believe Jesus is God. And they will therefore conclude that we are idolaters because we are worshiping a man. Now, is this a fair accusation?
No.
No. Thank you, Jesse.
So I've heard the same thing, but they say cultist instead of idolater because
He'll say it's what?
it's the litmus test if you're a cult or not.
Oh, a
For
cult.
many groups that if you worship a man, then you're a cult. If you worship God, then you're a religion. And so that's why we get labeled a cult a lot. And I use this to explain to people why we're labeled a cult, because we believe Jesus is a man, not because we do cult-like things. I
Right.
even go on to say we're not as energetic as the cults are. We probably take some lessons from the cults.
All right. Well, I'm going to read a couple here, kind of conclude with an interesting bang. And you'll see why this is an important topic. Okay. And these are quotes. I think I've got 3 of them. And I'll read them off the screen, so I don't have them on my notes. It is simple truth to say that if Jesus be not God, Christians are idolaters, for they worship one who is not God. There's no other alternative. And this is coming from a dictionary of the Bible from 1909. The next quote is more recent from 2021. This actually came from a podcast I listened to. It comes down to, if Jesus is anything less than the eternally begotten Son of God and you worship him, you sing to him with, really meaning it in your hearts, you're an idolater because you're worshiping a creature rather than the creator. And then the last quote, the doctrine of the Trinity, I can't even read it.
At the core.
Lies at the core.
The doctrine of the Trinity lies at the core of Christianity because it explains to us who God is and what he is like. And if you deny the doctrine of the Trinity, you're probably going to be denying either the deity of Christ, which would mean that you don't understand who he really is. You think he's just another human being like you, which is just utterly inadequate. You cannot worship him if he's just a human being. That would be idolatry and blasphemy. So I bring these up, and I think we've run out of time, just to kind of point out why this is an important topic. We started with a proper profession of faith upon which the church was going to be built. But you can see how important it has become, the answer to this question, to how you are viewed within the mainstream Christian church. And as far as mainstream Christianity is, we're a cult. And we're also idolaters. So welcome to the club. Are we out of time? Okay,
Great ending there, Phil.
thank you. Encouraging note to end on.
They're still working on their play up there, so we're gonna do the prayer for others down here, and then we'll go upstairs to see the closing. Sorry.